this on? Yeah, okay. Hi, guys. Good morning. I'm Jessica Knowles, and that's Jess Hutter. We are the two SACS PTC co-presidents. We just wanted to thank you guys so much for being here this morning for our April General PTC meeting. Before we get started with our wonderful programming, we do have a couple of quick business items to go through. One is we're going to first approve the meeting minutes from our last General PTC meeting, which was held in January. So can I please have someone make a motion to approve the minutes? Amy, can I have a second? Tia, I'm like, all right. All those in favor? Any opposed? All right, motion passes. And then I would like to ask for our approval of the proposed slate for the SACS PTC Executive Board for the 2024-2025 school year. We have, as co-presidents, Jess Hutter and Emily Cerrone. If we have any of our new incoming board members, if you guys want to just wave. Treasurer Beth Stimson, Assistant Treasurer Laura Sousa. The co-VPs of Communications, Lydia Kramer and Nadia Bischoff. Co-VP of Programs, Vanessa Laverne and Laura Catherwood. Co-VP of Ways and Means, Remy Salami and Lauren Nussbaum. Co-VP of Hospitality, Jessica Knowles and Amy Cardillo. And then our secretary is Karen Willett. Can I please have someone make a motion to approve our slate for next year? Tia? A second? Jess? All right. All those in favor? Anybody opposed? Oh.
I was like, geez.
Did you see those? All right, I'm assuming there's no opposition. The motion passes. And I did want to just take a quick second to thank all of our outgoing board members. Thank you guys so much for all of your hard work and dedication to the SACS community this year. It does not go unnoticed, and it's very, very much appreciated. So thank you, guys. Can I have everyone just give a quick round of applause? And then just two quick reminders before we get started. For any of our 8th grade parents that are here, please don't forget to purchase your lawn signs and your bash tickets. Photos, are they still accepting photos for the slideshow? Yes. Okay, send in photos for the slideshow, and just, there's been emails and there will continue to be emails with all of the necessary information, so just, make sure you keep checking those. And then we have Teacher Appreciation Week coming up the week of May 6th through 10th. And please check your emails there. We're looking for donations to help make that week special for our staff here. So thank you.
We are so fortunate to have such a great relationship with New Canaan Cares, who is able to bring in great speakers like Dr. Tuller and help us do these meetings. So I'm happy to introduce Maureen Aziel, the Education and Programs Manager, who will introduce our speaker for today.
Good morning. Thanks, SACS PTC. As you know, I'm Maureen, and I'm the Education and Program Manager. CARES' mission is to empower youth, strengthen family, and build community. And we provide responsive educational programming. We've heard from parents this year, and the resounding concern has been, how do we manage technology for our children? CARES has, over this spring, has curated 4 different adult programs. We've reached over 500 parents, and thanks to working with the schools, we've reached over 1,800 students and talking about technology in different facets. So we hope that this conversation continues at the individual and community level, and we all know it's happening at the national level. So we're excited to bring Dr. Tuller here to discuss the big 3, protecting executive functioning, self-esteem, and sleep in a teenage-wired world. Dr. Tuller is a clinical psychologist with over 18 years' experience working with children and adolescents. She's worked in a variety of clinical settings, including hospitals, schools, and outpatient programs. She currently practices downtown and specializes in cognitive behavioral therapy. The impact of screen use on children and adolescents' mental health is a topic that is close to her professional and personal heart. So thank you so much.
Good morning. Thank you, Maureen, for that introduction. It's on. Okay. And thank you to New Canaan Cares, and thank you to the SACS PTC for inviting me here today and giving me this opportunity to speak about a topic, again, that I think is incredibly important, both personally and professionally. It's a great way for us to continue the conversation that began a few weeks ago and that continued with Max Stossel's talk, and then Chrissy Katchny's talk earlier this week in the elementary school when we discussed how to develop and initiate relationship with technology in the younger years. Today here we're talking about our middle schoolers, primarily our tweens and our teens. That's a population that I find to be the most incredible to work with clinically. And I'm excited to review what I think is some of the most important information to know that's out there right now. So before we get into the meat of the presentation, just a little bit more about me and why I'm here talking about this topic. So I am a child and adolescent clinical psychologist. I practice here in New Canaan. I've been practicing for almost 2 decades. And since I began practicing almost 20 years ago, we've noticed a drastic increase in our mental health referral for our teen and tween population especially. We know that suicides are at an all-time high in our teenagers, and the mental health community is aware that there is a significant relationship between screens, screen time use, and the mental health crisis that we're experiencing right now. In addition to why I think this is important from a professional perspective, I'm a parent. We live here in New Canaan. I have 2 children in the public schools in New Canaan. I have a 5th grader here at SACS. I have a 2nd grader at East. And I have a lot of empathy for all of us in this room. We are the first generation of parents who are navigating raising our children in an incredibly digital and stressful world. We are an anxious generation of parents, and sometimes for a very good reason. And I put myself in all of your position when I tell you that this is very hard. Sometimes it's very, very difficult to know what the roadmap looks like. We don't have guidelines that are clear. And that really leads me into the third point in the introduction, which is that I really hope that this conversation empowers you with information and brings you confidence to go home and speak to your children and speak within your families about how you want the relationship at home with technology to look. So this first graph this first slide depicts 2 different graphs. The first you may recognize from Max Stossel's talk a few weeks ago, and I'll explain it in a little bit more detail. So the axis on the left-hand side is a measure of mental health quotient, which is a measure of mental health wellness. And on the bottom, you can see that this particular study is looking at the age of first smartphone ownership. So in this study, the researchers posed the question, what does our mental health quotient or our mental health wellness look like when we're given our children a smartphone at the age of 6, 7, and 8 versus 15, 16, and 17? And as you can see, the mental health wellness is significantly greater the later we're giving our children smartphones. The second graph, which wasn't in Max's talk, which I actually think is a little bit easier to understand, is the inverse relationship. And we understand that the percent of symptoms that are reported by teenagers around distressing symptomatology and struggling symptoms is greater the earlier we are giving our children smartphones versus later. So we have many studies like this. This is just one as an example. A few years ago, we thought clinically that the relationship between technology and screens was impacting our children, but we really didn't know for sure what that looked like. We didn't have the science behind it. So this is one particular study that I included at the end of the slide if you want to go and take a look at it. that really gives some clear data as to what we're seeing happening. So the next thing that clinical psychologists and researchers really needed to understand was, we know that there's a relationship between screens, and we know that there's a relationship between screens and our mental health crisis, but what's happening in between? That's what we didn't quite understand. What are the mechanisms by which the introduction of screens and screen time is impacting the mental health in our children? And that's really what I want to talk about in the greatest detail today. Because when I refer to the big three, I'm talking about executive functioning, I'm talking about self-esteem, and I'm talking about sleep. These variables are the ones in which what we consider from a statistical perspective mediate or moderate the relationship between screens and mental health. And I'm going to go into detail about all three of these and what to be looking for when you're thinking about your children at home. And then I'm also hoping that we have a little bit of time to talk about some takeaways and where to go from here. Okay, so this first one, executive functioning, you've heard it. It's a buzzword right now, right? We have ability to hire executive functioning coaches. We know that if we have diagnoses like ADHD, we have deficits in this area of executive functioning. We read that executive functioning is an important skill set to have, but what is it, right? So executive functioning is actually a multidimensional construct. It's not one single thing. And the importance of having executive functioning skills from a psychologist's perspective is arguably one of the most important set of skills to have from an academic, a career, and a relationship success perspective. So when we lag developmentally in our executive functioning skills, that puts our children at a disadvantage. Executive functioning covers all of these components, so flexible thinking, working memory, being self-aware, planning and prioritizing, initiating tasks, organizing, impulse control, emotion regulation, and thinking flexibly. So it covers a lot, right? What we're noticing in the world of clinical psychology is that in comparison to 20 years ago, the executive functioning skill set of our youth is dramatically impaired. And what we now believe is one of the major contributors to that is our 24/7 access to technology, screens, and information. And I'm going to talk a little bit about an example of I think that hits home as to why this takes place. Speaking from my professional hat, one of the trends that I notice now in my practice more than ever is the number of college students who are successfully graduating high school, attending very great universities, and then coming home after first semester unable to complete second semester. 9 times out of 10, it's because there's a deficit in executive functioning skills, and they're ending up in my office because they're having a difficult time. So in order to really kind of depict an example of executive functioning, I'm going to take you back in a time machine to when we were in middle school, or at least when I was in middle school. And I want you to think about what it was like to be a middle schooler. I can remember this particular example that I'm going to give you was probably my first memory of academic stress. I was probably in 7th grade, and it was a spring weekend. I had a birthday party that I was invited to, a sleepover that was the place to be on Friday night, and I had a out-of-town sports event Saturday and half of the day on Sunday, and I had a term English paper that was due on Monday. So in 7th grade, when I was in middle school, in order to research and write a paper, I had to go to the library, right? So the library in our town would close at 8, maybe 9 o'clock at night on a weekend. So I knew that if I wanted to go to this birthday party and go away to this sports weekend, then turn in the paper on Monday and I estimated I needed 2 days to write the paper, then I need to start writing the paper on Wednesday, right? Because the library would close and I would need to be able to spread it out over 2 days. Fast forward to today. So that same 7th grader can come home from her sports weekend and stay up until midnight to finish the paper because she has access to the internet at all times, right? Both students are going to have the same outcome, potentially. They're both going to hand in the paper. Maybe they're both going to get a great grade on the paper. I'm sure my grade was great. But the second student, our middle schoolers today, lose out on the ability to develop this executive functioning skill, the ability to think back and plan and organize their time. I want you to think about what it was like when you were younger and you came home and you knew you had to get your work done because at 8 o'clock at night on a Thursday, that's when the first episode that week of Friends would air, right? You needed to think through what was a priority. Right now, we have the ability to binge an entire series of Friends over a weekend, right? So there's a difference in the way that we're managing our relationship with technology and the way that our children are growing up managing their relationship with technology. The other thing that I think is important to think about with executive functioning is what I call the chocolate cake effect. And Chrissy talked a little bit about this in her talk earlier this week as well. But executive functioning is the ability to initiate and persist on a task that is not so interesting. Can anybody think of a task that we ask our middle schoolers to do on a regular basis that is a little tricky to get started and sometimes hard to keep up with? You can just yell it out if you think of it. Yeah. Okay, chores, cleaning the room. Yeah, homework, right? Writing. So in this example, what came to mind for me was homework, right? So when we are given the option of having a wonderfully, deliriously delicious piece of chocolate cake, and then we're asked to finish our dinner of green beans and chicken, it's all of a sudden not as appetizing, right? The same goes for things like the dopamine hits that come with TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat. When we're allowing our children to have access in middle school to those particular apps and that technology, we are inherently making it harder for them to focus then on a task that's not as exciting. It's just what happens in our life. It's much easier for us to engage in something that is very, very reinforcing than something that is a little bit more boring. So for this reason, I encourage families in my practice to think about technology and screens as a dessert, right? So we talk about a healthy meal. We don't encourage our families or encourage our children to be always eating one type of food. We need to have our middle schoolers engage in things like after school play, even in middle school, social interactions off of electronics. We need to ask them to be participating in physical activity to move their bodies. And when we are hitting those components, then we can add some dessert, right? Then we can add some screen. It's a very tricky thing for an adolescent themselves to prioritize those components over something that's so exciting as a streak on Snapchat. So that kind of summarizes a little bit more about why we need as parents to really help our children with this executive functioning, really reinforcing that and strengthening that muscle. The second factor that I want to talk about is self-esteem. So in clinical psychology, one of the greatest predictors of mental health distress is self-esteem. In our adolescent population, in our middle school population, one of the most sensitive times for self-esteem development is during the middle school years. This particular study that I'm going to talk about is one of over 100,000. When I went to go update this talk in my academic search engine, I entered social media and self-esteem. Over 100,000 peer-reviewed academic articles were published in this area. So we know that there is an impact between social media and self-esteem. But one study in particular that I'm going to talk about gives a little bit more of an interesting kind of spin on why that might be happening specifically in the adolescent brain. So I'm going to walk you through this one because I think it's a particularly interesting one. It looks at fMRI studies and the adolescent population. So in this particular study, 32 teenagers between the ages of 13 and 18 were told that they were participating in a small social network focus group. The researchers showed them 148 photographs on a screen for 12 minutes, and that included 40 photos that each teenager submitted themselves, and then analyzed their brain activity using an fMRI, which looked at brain activity associated with blood flow. Each photo was also displayed with the number of likes underneath it, and those likes had been supposedly received from the other teenagers in the group, but in fact, they were arbitrarily assigned by the researchers. Here were the key takeaways of the study. Number one, viewing the photos with many compared to just a few likes was associated with greater activity in the neural region of the brain implicated with reward processing, self-esteem, social cognition, imitation, and attention. And in deciding whether to click that they liked a photo, the teenagers were highly influenced by the number of likes that the photo already had. So what's the main point here? Well, we know that in a time in which our children are already starting to really think about their self-identity and develop their own sense of self-esteem, the introduction of an additional variable that can create an incredible stressor can be very dangerous, right? So it's not to say that social media is a negative across the board. My question, or what I want to pose to you is adolescence, this time in middle school, the best time for them to be exposed to the material, right? The study also asked the participants, which I think is, as a psychologist working with kids, some of the most important information is asking the kids what they think, even though they want the access to the app. And in the study, 71% of the participants reported that social media has a negative impact on their body image. 28% said both, negative and positive, and only 1% said positive. So even despite the fact that we know that they are wanting access to social media, they're telling us that they think it's bad, right? So there's what they're saying, and then also what their desire is. One thing that I think about when I imagine what it's like for a parent and developmentally what it's like for an adolescent with social media is back when, if you remember when your children were young and they were like 6 months old, 8 months old, and they were just starting to learn how to move around. I had friends in my mom group that actually even hired like a safety consultant, right, to come into your home and like baby-proof your home. And I had a pediatrician give me the advice of walk around, like crawl around on the floor and see like what are the dangers. Think about what it's like from a middle school perspective, what it was like for you in middle school, how sensitive of a time that was for your own self-identity and development, and then think about what dangerous things could add to that, right? And that's kind of the way that I imagine it for me as a parent. If I spent all that time trying to create an environment in which my baby was feeling safe, in middle school, I want to continue that safety. So, wired and tired. So we have an epidemic of insomnia in our country, And it's for a variety of different reasons. Some of them are because of overscheduling. Sometimes obesity is a factor. But we do know without a doubt that access to screens, especially before bed, is causing sleep detriment in adults and in our children. There's a reason why in the DSM, which is the manual in which we work as psychologists to understand what diagnostic criteria someone meets when they have anxiety or depression, for example, there's a reason why with anxiety and depression diagnoses, sleep impairment is almost always a criteria. Sleep is paramount to our mental health. We must protect sleep when we think about trying to mitigate the risk of depression or anxiety in our kids. And what we know is that there's a definite relationship between screens and sleep problems. So in this example, I want to describe a little bit about this study. So adolescents' electronic media use at night, sleep disturbance, and depressive symptoms in the smartphone age. This graph, or this image, shows in better detail than I can explain that sleep difficulties is mediating or moderating the relationship between electronic media use and depressive symptoms. What that means is that this variable, sleep problems, is impacting the other two variables. So the same is true when I talk about self-esteem and I talk about executive functioning. We can think of it the same way. So when we think about technology and screens, the relationship is not so simple. It is not that screens are impacting negatively the mental health of our children, right? What we know is that there are variables that are existing in between, and one of them, for example, is sleep, and it's accounting for some of that relationship. So in this particular example, the depressive symptoms were measured, and the electronic media use before bed was measured. And there are 3 ways in which we know that screens are affecting sleep, and that's some that are very intuitive and some that are a little bit less intuitive. So time to placement of sleep is simple. You probably have experienced this yourself. You mean to go to bed at 11, all of a sudden it's midnight, you've been scrolling on your phone, you're trapped in a Taylor Swift, Travis Kelce reel, or there's a whole bunch of different reasons why we tend to engage in time displacement of sleep, and screens are definitely one in which is impacting us and can impact our children. The other one, second, is psychological stimulation from media content. That is when we watch something before bed, and it could be on TV, it could be on our phone, it could be on an iPad, it's not necessarily specifically on a phone. It activates our brain to think about the content, right? So if we're listening to a true crime podcast or watching something on Netflix, and there's any sort of content that is either exciting, interesting, or negatively exciting and interesting, it can impact the time in which we fall asleep. And that is definitely true for our middle schoolers. When we have the access to that technology before they go to bed, they're often thinking about those things, and it's pushing their bedtime back. And then the third is light-emitting screens. So we also understand that in many technological devices, there's a blue light mechanism that actually impacts the way that our brain produces melatonin, and that is over time negatively affecting the quality of sleep and the amount of sleep that we're getting. So that's one of the reasons why, and one of the recommendations that I will make, is that a lot of providers suggest that we should keep no electronics in the bedroom because although I could sleep next to my phone with absolutely no problem because sleep isn't a highly reinforcing variable for me, my middle schooler could not, right? If there is an alert or a message or a notification, that's going to be so reinforcing for him to want to look at that not having it in the bedroom at all is the simplest and most ideal solution. Okay, so a note about individual differences, which I think is really important. So I don't know how much longer I'm going to be able to use these photos because my 5th grader is getting a little bit bigger, but these are my 2 kids. I have so many stories of when my 2nd was born, calling the pediatrician once every few days. Oh, Brody, he's not sleeping like my first, like Jake. He's not soothed like Jake. He's not eating like Jake, right? I couldn't wrap my head around why there were so many differences between my 2nd and my first. And at my 1-month visit, my pediatrician sat me down and she said, Kelly, it's your 2nd baby, but it's your first Brody, right? So all of our children are different within our family, and our children across families, all of our children in this room are different. As a parent, you know your child best. So when you're observing them on technology and engaging with screens, and you're noticing that some of your children may be able to absolutely transition and handle a different amount, and others cannot, that's true. I have one child who could eat an entire box of candy before bed at 8 o'clock at night and fall asleep at 8:30 with absolutely no problem. I have another that can't even smell candy after 3 p.m. and he's up until midnight. So there's a difference between that. That's why there's no one size fits all here. The brain and the body in our children just reacts differently to all sorts of different stimuli, and that may be in your family and in across families why things look different in different homes and different houses. So what do we do? So if I can think of 4 things on the side of what to do and 4 things on the side of what not to do, that might be concrete enough to kind of give you something to grasp onto, to go home and think about some potential changes to make. So first and foremost, modeling. This is like the most painful one. But I want to share with you, I'm part of a national study that is looking at the attitudes of children towards their parents' technology use. And right now we're still reviewing the preliminary data, but we have over 2,000 responses from middle school age children. And the researcher asked the primary question, do you think your parent is addicted to their phone? Over 70% said yes. So let that sink in for just a minute. Modeling the way that we engage with our devices and how we think about our values when it comes to devices is probably the number 1 way that we can influence our children and our adolescents' relationship with devices. In our house, for example, we have no devices at the dinner table. We do not use the phone when we're driving. We don't have the phone out as parents, we don't have the phone out when we're playing games. We don't have the phone out when we're watching a movie together. And sometimes when you have to watch Kung Fu Panda 3 times in a row, you really want to be on your phone. And occasionally that's okay, but I'll tell you, my kids will catch me and they'll say, I thought this was family movie night. And actually, my 2nd grader gave a great example. When I'm on my phone, he can't put his head in my lap because my arms are blocking his way. And he's not going to ask me that for very much longer. And so that really gets me to stop and think about those times in which not having access and turning that off is really valuable. When I work with families, I ask them to think about what are the things when your children do have access to devices like smartphones will really irk you? What are the places and situations that you want them to not be on their phone? Is that at the dinner table? Is that when you're driving and trying to have a conversation? Those are where we should start trying to limit or eliminate our use of those devices. One of the things that I think about when I think about like a depressed teenager sitting in their bed on a phone, it makes me so sad, right? just kind of scrolling and just laying vertically and kind of being very, very, very still or quiet. And I think to myself, okay, so if I am hoping that my fifth grader doesn't engage in that, I need to be really careful about him walking into me in my room, in my bed, scrolling on my phone, right? If I don't want him to engage in that later, I need to be mindful of that. So modeling is as simple and as difficult as that is at the same time. So really thinking about what's important to you in your home, and again, it's going to be different across different homes and different situations, and starting to watch and monitor how you're using devices. I'm going to kind of skip over collaborative contracts only because Chrissy did a great job, and I think her slides are going to be posted in her talk on Tuesday about collaborative contracts. But the gist of a collaborative contract, is a family agreement, and it's a fluid document. For example, in our home, it changes. It changes as my children get older, and it changes in different situations. But it's essentially a tool in which we can start talking to our kids and talking to other members of our family, our partners and spouses, about how we want to have a relationship with technology at home. And this is kind of an initiation or a jumping off point, and I think that they can be really useful. Device curfews and screen-free activities. I talked a little bit about screen-free activities for the examples that I use. Device curfews, I work with a lot of families who struggle with this one, but I would tell you that a device curfew is essentially a time in which we put our devices away, right? We might put them in the kitchen to charge. We might, put them in a neutral space. But we're asking our kids to step away from devices, including their laptop that they use at school, right? And we're putting in place a parameter that works for you at your home. And we actually have a system set in place that when my fifth grader gets a bit older will be more applicable, that there won't be any access to the internet, even for school-based reasons, after a certain time. And that's a hard pill sometimes for families to swallow. I had one family who really struggled because, their eighth grader needed to finish an assignment, and if you have this curfew in place, then you can't get this paper in, and there's a lot of stress around that. And I completely understand, and there are situations where you may have to modify, but in general, as a psychologist, I'll tell you that I would rather have the natural consequence of my child learning that there is a cause and effect of not planning something ahead happen in middle school than I would have it happen in high school or beyond, right? So we spend a lot of time right now, our generation of parents spend a lot of time rescuing our children from disappointment and rescuing them from not feeling uncomfortable. And one of the flip sides of that is that we tend to try to solve a lot of their problems. And if we can encourage them to learn those lessons when they're younger, the stakes are lower than later in life when we can't step in and rescue them, and the stakes are much higher. So I would rather have my middle schooler develop that sense of ownership over their time and not being able to access certain material at a certain point in the night, than later have a poor relationship with sleep or a poor relationship with their executive functioning skills. And then lastly, it does us no good to put our head in the sand and pretend like the world is not full of technology and that it's not moving in a direction where it's going to be a part of our lives and probably much, much more moving into the future. And so we really need to, as parents, speak our kids' digital language. We get a lot of credit when we understand what it is like for them to be limiting on their devices, when we have empathy for them, when we understand what technology is the most kind of up and cool right now. And so instead of kind of trying to pretend as if it doesn't exist and put ourselves in a bubble, really embracing it in the sense of knowing what those apps are. We know that there are apps that hide apps on the phone, right? That kind of conceal. Kids are so smart. They can figure these things out so much faster than we can. So it really does us a benefit by being able to do our research and figure out what the language is going on right now. So here, again, there's 4 things to do. If you can think about those, and then here's 4 things that I would really encourage you not to do. So no social media accounts before the age of 13. Later is better. 13 is an arbitrary guideline that is set by the US government because there's no medical or psychological backing to it. It's the time in which the government has decided that we can share our children's data, and that's it. So you need to be 13 to register for many social media apps. I encourage you that 13 is the absolute earliest, and more like 16 is when in our house and in my clinical practice, I encourage families to go. And again, it goes back to that period of sensitivity of middle school being a time in which our self-esteem is already very normally fragile and vulnerable. That's a very developmentally normal thing to experience. But introducing something like social media can really put a threat in place that doesn't necessarily have to be there. Number 2, no electronics in the bedroom. No electronics in the bedroom. That's as far as we personally go, not just phones. We don't have computers in the bedroom. We have no iPads in the bedroom. In my experience, sleep is a variable that needs to be fiercely protected in my house. And I see it in my practice. One of the first things that I work on with kids before I refer them for any sort of medication consultation is, are you getting enough sleep, right? So electronics in the bedroom, we know that it impairs sleep. And if you set this up at home, that there's no access to it in the bedroom, it can be much simpler to control. Similarly, restrict screens for at least an hour before bedtime. We know that access to screens, like for all the reasons that I discussed before bed, can stimulate the brain. It encourages us to our brain be on versus off. We want to shut our brain down before we're trying to fall asleep. So restricting that before bed is really important. And the last one, I'll explain a little bit more because it's not as intuitive. I feel strongly that if you can avoid it, not to give an electronic as a gift, and I'll explain why. So when we give and receive a gift, psychologically something happens to the gift giver and the gift receiver. And what occurs is that we believe inherently that there's ownership over that gift, right? What we engage in our house and what I encourage families to do in my clinical practice is to think about technology as a tool. So we have communication tools, we have entertainment tools like gaming devices, we have academic tools like our computers, our Chromebooks, and the tools are ones in which we are allowing in middle school age, later it may be different, but in middle school age, to use with our permission, right? So there are tools and they're using them with our permission. When we give them as a gift, it makes it much more difficult to place limitations and to change the rules around them. We feel guilty, even if we don't know it. It's an underlying process that occurs, and our child feels upset because it feels like that's theirs, right? That's their gift. So when possible, that's my recommendation, to avoid giving it as a gift. Just to summarize a little bit, one of the reasons why I think that in this particular conversation, it's useful to highlight those 3 variables, self-esteem, sleep, and executive functioning, is when you think about it, when we understand what's happening in between screen use and negative mental health outcomes, we have more control, right? We have more influence. So if we know that sleep, self-esteem, and executive functionings are variables that are sensitive when we're using technology, we can also bolster those areas in other ways. Because like I said, we know that there's no way to completely put ourselves in a bubble and protect from having screens be involved in our children's lives. So we may choose to encourage self-esteem, increase self-esteem and buffer against the effects of social media by engaging in self-esteem promoting activities for our teenagers. We may decide to limit activities in the evening to protect their sleep. We may decide to coach them and encourage them to learn more about their executive functioning skills and how they learn. And when we think about it that way, we have a little bit more control as parents. We're allowed to understand that technology is going to interface, and that's okay, but that these are the ways in which we need to be thinking about and looking at the vulnerability factors in our middle schoolers especially. So a few recommendations that I have at the end of my presentation. These are links. The lab report is one of the studies that was linked in the beginning. There's a lot of great information on technology use, families, and collaborative contracts on Common Sense Media. Wait Until 8th is a national organization that promotes waiting, giving a smartphone until 8th grade. So that's not necessarily meaning a communication device can't be given beforehand, but that an access to a full-on computer isn't given until later. And then that's my contact information if you have any questions. But I think we have a little bit of time for questions. Yeah, so if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them. Yeah, Maureen? So Maureen asked, in terms of executive functioning, what can we do to circumvent that delay? So some simple things are setting up schedules at home. For example, not having 24-hour access to the internet. So in the situation where I gave the example of when I was in 7th grade and what a 7th grader would experience now, that 7th grader can get that assignment completed because they can do what they needed to do over the weekend and then go home and have 3 or 4 hours at night writing their paper. When we put procedure in place at home in which we're limiting that by nature, so we're having a device curfew or the internet shuts off at 10 p.m. and so sorry, that's just the way that it is. We're going to work around it. It's going to take 1 or 2 times, and then I promise you, your middle schooler is going to start thinking about when that assignment needs to be done and how it needs to be done differently. So those are some small ways that we can put that into place. But in general, what we see as a kind of a community is that one of the things that our parents didn't do for us that we tend to do for our kids is rescue them a bit more. So for example, if your child forgets their gym clothes or their lunch, I don't know about you, but like my mom never dropped my gym clothes or lunch off at school. I'm one of the first ones that will do it as a parent, but I'm very mindful that that can create a relationship in which my child doesn't have to think about that when they're walking out the door, right? So it's not to say that we shouldn't support and help our children, but when you think about the ways in which it may be okay to let them have a lesson, it does help with their ability to process and use their executive functioning skills. That was a good question. Any other questions? I would say yes. The hour rule, I would say yes. Because we don't know if they may develop that relationship and difficulty with falling asleep later, and then it's harder to walk back from that guideline than it is to put in place ahead of time. Now, when I say screens, I know that television is in that same category, but television is different. We know that that type of media is actually different than what our kids are doing when they're scrolling online. So TV might look a little bit differently if it's a show that is not like high intensity in content or violence or something like that, right? That's getting them really stimulated, and it's something in which is like more calming. That might be outside of the realm of screens. I'm thinking more like what they're doing when they're surfing on the internet or on YouTube and things like that. Yeah. Yeah. So it's a great question. So the question was, what about a Kindle, right? So is a Kindle treated the same way as other devices? And the answer is it depends. If you notice that your child is having access, so again, Kindle provides access, right? My 5th grader loves reading on his Kindle, and I wouldn't dream of restricting the amount of time that he's reading, whether it's in a book or on a Kindle. But when he finishes a book, he doesn't have to put that book away. He has immediate ability to choose a next book, right? So there are restrictions that I put in place right before bed on using the Kindle, because I do worry that that ability to kind of regulate himself and not stay up and keep reading could be problematic. But if you're noticing that your child is reading their Kindle at night, again, it doesn't have the same blue light effect as the phone does or the iPad does. It's different. So one of those 3 variables is taken away. It could still be one of the other 2, just like a regular book could, right? Chrissy? Thank you for that call out. So Chrissy just summarized that for anyone who can't hear, that in addition to having trouble falling asleep, there's a body of research now that is indicating that use of screens before bed is actually impacting the quality of sleep. So putting that hour in place can be beneficial. Yeah. So I just want to make sure I understand the question. So if there's like a separation, like going away for 8 weeks for summer camp, like no tech, right? Yes, yes. Tech-free vacations, whether that's a camp that initiates it intentionally or a policy that you might put in place as a family by taking time away from devices, is beneficial. We know that that is true. There's a positive relationship between also one factor that we didn't talk about is addiction. And that's because I could talk to you about it for hours. But it's the way in which technology in this particular capacity, a device like a phone or an iPad, impacts the dopamine production in the brain is just like crack cocaine. And so the challenge is that for our young kids who can't regulate that, they are flooded with that stimuli. And then essentially coming down from it, removing it, is going through withdrawal, right? So if they have an opportunity to engage in something like that, the biggest thing that I see is the transition back to the real world can be a little jolting, but the carryover effect is positive. Any other questions? No? Okay. Oh, yeah. Mhm. Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was, for children who have an established deficit in executive functioning, like an ADHD process, how does that potentially look differently in any of these three processes, especially with executive functioning? And you're correct in assuming that our kids who already struggle in that area have a tougher time not only managing their own response to technology because it is highly rewarding, but it does impair them further in terms of their executive functioning skill set. So for these kids, and that's why I lay out those three variables, because they are different. We may have children who are very robust in their self-esteem. They may be able to handle access to social media apps. Arguably, in middle school, no one has really robust self-esteem, but that may be a possibility, right? If you know that your child already struggles in the area of executive functioning, it's doubly important to have a careful consideration of how much access they have to screens, because they're already kind of working out from underneath, right? There are some really good ones, and I think Chrissy's talk is going to be published, right? So when Chrissy presented her talk in the elementary school, she gave a good list of monitoring. Bark is one of them that I've heard really great things about. I know Disney Circle has one that's supposedly very good as well. We haven't gotten into the monitoring systems in our home. My 5th grader does not have a smartphone. But when we do introduce a phone, we'll introduce a GAB phone or something like that as a communication tool, and delay access to a more digitally complicated iPhone until later. But similarly, those are the types of companies that are producing systems and then devices that allow what we may want as a family, like communication, but disengage access to some of the things that we're trying to prevent. Yeah, you're welcome. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Thank you so much for today, and we all learned a lot, so.
Again, thank you to Dr. Teller. It was so great to have you here. And thank you guys all for coming today. We really appreciate it. Have a good rest of your day.